Hello, friends. Welcome to Science Talk. I am your host and resident oceanographer, Jim Massa. I want to discuss with you what we see here, quantifying the carbon export and sequestration pathways of the ocean's biological carbon pump. Now, this is an extremely detailed paper. I'm not going to cover the paper here. I will leave the URL link in the comment section for those who are interested in looking at it. They spend a lot of most of the paper explaining in detailing how they develop the models, the methodologies, uh, data collection analyses, etc. What I want to do is I'll share with you some portions from the introduction, and then we'll head to the abstract to give the summation of what they found. And it is the summation that is what I really want to share with you for what the implications are. So here we go. Let's jump right down to the introduction. Okay. The biological carbon pump is a collection of processes that transport organic carbon from the surface ocean to depth. It is responsible for approximately two-thirds of the surface to deep gradient in dissolved inorganic carbon, usually abbreviated DIC, in the ocean. And they list a bunch of a reference here, and thus plays an important role in regulating Earth's carbon cycle and climate, followed by a whole bunch of other references there. The biological pump begins in the euphotic zone, where phytoplankton fix the dissolved inorganic carbon into organic carbon via photosynthesis. Zooplankton grazing and microbial activities convert most of this fixed carbon to CO2 in the upper ocean, where it can be reused or returned to the atmosphere, reused presumably by phytoplanktons. However, a portion of it is exported and respired in the deep ocean, where the resulting CO2 can be sequestered for years to centuries. Despite the importance of these processes in regulating global climate, the biological carbon pump and its impacts on the global carbon cycle remain poorly characterized. This includes the global magnitude of carbon export, which is estimated at between 5 and 12 petagrams. The capital P, that's 10 to the 15. Okay? So it's basically 5 and 12 times 10 to the 15 grams of carbon per year, right? That's what this is. Petagrams is 10 to the 15 grams of carbon per year. And the sequestration of respired carbon, which has been estimated between 1,000 and 3,000 petagrams. Furthermore, the relative importance of the various different mechanisms or pathways that contribute to biological carbon export and sequestration in the ocean is even more poorly quantified. Now, this is an important right here. So let me just see if I can highlight that. Okay. The biological carbon pump operates by three primary pathways. The gravitational pump, basically just passive sinking, includes the passive sinking of particulate organic carbon, that's POC, as aggregates, carcasses, fecal pellets. Collectively, we call it marine snow. The migrant pump includes the active transport of carbon by vertically migrating zooplankton and fishes. The vertically migrating zooplankton, they usually follow a daily cycle where they go usually at nighttime when they cannot be seen as well. They go up into shallow water layers to graze upon the phytoplankton, and then they go back down to depth out of the photic zone during the daylight hours. That process is called diel vertical migration. Okay? The mixing pump includes the physical transport of both suspended POC, right, particular organic carbon, and dissolved organic carbon, DOC, by vertical mixing, seasonal mix layer detrayment, eddy subduction. Then Resplandi et al. In 2019, large-scale ocean circulation. So what they're talking about is the migrant pump is that the organisms actively, by their moving vertically up and down in the column through defecation, respiration, whatever, they're moving the carbon around. The gravitational pump is passive sinking, and then we have the mixing, which actually involves physical transport, such as the actual physics that's taking place in the ocean. Vertical currents, horizontal currents, upwelling, downwellings, that kind of stuff. That's what they're getting at. They go on to say that little is known about the total carbon sequestration supported by each of the export pathways. A recent review, Boyd et al. In 2019, used a simple scaling method to estimate global carbon sequestration by different export pathways, revealing uncertainties of at least 50%. So, yeah, there's a lot of information we need to find out. The regional distribution of carbon sequestration by the biological pump, as well as the characteristic sequestration timescale for exported carbon, remain unquantified. Total carbon sequestration for each pathway is controlled by the geographic distribution of carbon export, the remineralization depth scale of exported carbon, and the ocean's overturning circulation. Since all these aspects are sensitive to climate change, it is important to have a baseline estimate of the global distribution of carbon export and sequestration by the different biological pump pathways in the contemporary ocean. And they go on from there. And then I said they spend quite a bit of time in the paper discussing the models that they develop, the implementation of the model, how they collected data, how they measured the analyses, etc. So now let's look at the abstract. The ocean's biological carbon pump transfers carbon from the surface ocean to the deep ocean by several distinct pathways, including gravitational settling of organic particles, mixing and evection of suspended organic carbon, and active transport by vertically migrating metazoans. Carbon exported by these pathways can be sequestered as respired CO2 in the deep ocean for years to centuries. However, the contribution of each pathway to carbon export and sequestration remains highly uncertain. Here, satellite and in situ ocean biogeochemical observations are assimilated in an ensemble numerical model of the biological pump to quantify global and regional carbon export and sequestration. The ensemble mean global carbon export is 10.2 petagrams of carbon per year, and the total amount of carbon sequestered via the biological pump is 1,300 petagrams of carbon. The gravitational pump is responsible for about 70% of the total global carbon export, 85% of which is zooplankton fecal pellets, 15% is sinking phytoplankton aggregates, while migrating zooplankton account for 10% of total export, and physical mixing is responsible for the remaining 20%. These pathways have different sequestration times, with an average of 140 years for the gravitational pump, 150 years for the migrant pump, and only 50 years for the mixing pump. That's important, by the way, that 50 years, basically one-third the time. Regionally, the largest sequestration inventories and longest sequestration times are found in the northern high latitudes, while the shortest sequestration times are found in the subtropical gyres. These results suggest that ocean carbon storage, this is really important, this is why I wanted to share this with you. These results suggest that ocean carbon storage will weaken as the oceans stratify and the subtropical gyres expand. As they get larger, cover more latitudinal regions and zonings due to anthropogenic climate change. In other words, the overall implication is that sequestration to depth of carbon will decrease. And that carbon, especially if it's the CO2 form, will guess what? Will make its way back into the surface of the layers and make its way back into the atmosphere. Whereas sequestering it to depth removes it for quite some time. Okay, now the plain language summary. Tiny organisms called phytoplankton help to reduce atmospheric CO2 levels by absorbing large amounts of carbon in the surface ocean during photosynthesis. Various biological and physical processes or pathways then work together to transfer some of this carbon to the deep ocean where it can be stored for potentially hundreds of years. In this study, we examine these pathways using computer models that are consistent with data from satellite-based sensors and ocean observations. Our model shows that the most important pathways for carbon storage are transport by sinking particles swimming zooplankton, while transport by ocean currents is the least important pathway. The North Atlantic and North Pacific Oceans have the greatest carbon storage power, while the subtropical oceans have the least. These results imply that ocean carbon storage may decrease in the future because subtropical regions, the gyres referenced in the non-plain language abstract, will expand in a warming climate. Okay, so why do they say the North Atlantic and North Pacific Oceans have the greatest carbon storage power? Simple. You have stratification, then the stratification breaks down, so then you have vertical mixing and sinking. That's why. In the tropics, you pretty much almost have a year-round stratified surface water with a thermocline that prevents mixing and transport, vertical transport to depth. That's why. Really, really straightforward there. So what's interesting is that when you look at different sequestration time, so in other words, the gravitational pump can sequester material for 140 years, the migrant pump for 150 years, but only 50 years for the basically physical processes. Now the question then becomes, to what depth are the physical processes felt to? And the answer is, depends what latitude you're at. So if you have active turnovers, active mixing in the water column, well, that will explain why this is 1/3 the time of the other two mechanisms. But what they have finding and what they're sharing with us is that as the oceans stratify, as the oceans get warmer and the warm temperature regimes expand to mid and higher latitudes, the ability of the oceans to take the carbon and sequester it to depth will greatly reduce. And of course, with that, as you stratify, you also lose the ability to sequester heat at the same time. So they're basically, and again, they admit that this is there's a lot of missing data. There's a lot of information that needs to be found because let's face it, the ocean is kind of a big place, and but they're getting preliminary data. And by the way, they did this over the entire planet, so this is an extremely ambitious, comprehensive study. But what they basically is they're finding verification of some of the principles that I've discussed with you, namely that as the oceans stratify, the sequestration of carbon, heat, etc., will decrease. Well, they're now basically finding such results to back up our, which is a nice verification of our understanding of the principles involved here. So, bottom line. Oceans are stratifying. It reduces, prevents, but reduces greatly sequestration of carbon and heat to depth. Therefore, that carbon will stay longer in the upper layers where eventually it could make its way back into the atmosphere. Another important aspect of all of this. So, as I said, I will leave this URL in the comments section for those who want to pour through this paper. Take some time to get through it. But there you have it. And the other important thing is that subtropical gyre is expanding. That is significant. They're getting bigger. That has profound implications. It will start interfering with any deep water formation, mixing, vertical mixing, which then impacts, bringing nutrients up into the surface, for the upwelling regions, etc. I'll have more on that though with some other videos I've got coming down that will discuss a lot of this. But this to me is profound, as that has major implications for the physics of the ocean, but has major implications for climate overall. Because if the subtropical gyres expand, the stratification expands, which means the sequestration decreases greatly, and also the heat content will build up more so in the upper layers, and that will eventually diffuse back to the atmosphere along with the CO2. So, very interesting, and we'll talk soon. Hello, folks. This is Jim here with Science Talk, asking you to please subscribe to my channel and to inform others of my channel and of the work that I do. Please share to social media platforms that you use. Also, as a reminder, don't forget to click the bell so that you know when I load up more videos. Finally, I ask that you support the work that I do by becoming a patron at patreon.com. Details in the description box below. Thank you for your support.